Congratulations on your film, Whitney. Can I Be Me? Can you just clear up for us a bit of confusion, which some people might have over who's doing what? There is another film by Kevin MacDonald, which has got the authorization of the Whitney Houston estate. Yours is not that film, is it? Yours is the unauthorized version.
Yeah, mine is the unauthorized version, which probably tells the truth, and which I believe is the one that portrays the real relationship with Robin Crawford and Bobby Brown, who are two people that the estate wants to completely disassociate themselves with. I think those were the two most important relationships in Whitney's life, and the estate had done everything possible to badmouth Bobby Brown and blame him for everything that went wrong, and to, in a way, pretend that Robin Crawford, who was probably the most important character in Whitney's life, never existed.
Did you have any dealings with the estate? Did you try to get them on side at all?
Initially, we tried to get Clive Davis involved. We asked Clive Davis if he would participate in the film, but he didn't want to. And then we kind of, very early on, received a barrage of phone calls. The estate were represented by the William Morris Agency, and the William Morris Agency was calling Showtime up in a sort of semi-threatening way, telling Showtime not to make the film, and Showtime just sort of told them what they could do with themselves. But right from the beginning, they've been unbelievably aggressive, and until this very day, they've been constantly trying to bring lawsuits against the film and to dissuade people not to take part in the film. And fortunately, a lot of Whitney's really close friends and band members felt that the estate had served her very badly and had basically been using her for money. And they were encouraged to take part in the film, I think, because the estate wrote to them and told them. So in a perverse way, I think the estate has helped us out.
There is a double edge, I guess, when you get authorization from an estate of somebody who you're making a film about. Being very, very careful not to badmouth Kevin MacDonald, who is an acclaimed filmmaker. Do you think that his film may suffer some sort of compromise?
I don't know. And of course, I respect Kevin. He's a friend of mine. We'll wait and see what he comes up with. He normally comes up with something interesting. I think if he is answerable to the estate, and the estate wants to somehow has a vested interest in creating their own history, that's a big limitation.
You're a well-known documentarian, and when it comes to making a film, you must have such a range of subjects that you can pick. Why did Nick Broomfield choose to make a film about a very well-known celebrity train wreck? I mean, the story's been told a number of times. What motivated you to make this film about Whitney Houston?
Because I think she was incorrectly portrayed as a train wreck. And I think that she was judged and condemned and sentenced by the majority of the public, not just in America, but certainly in Australia. And there was very little attempt to really understand what was happening to her or what she'd been through. From being America's darling, she became somebody who was routinely ridiculed on the late-night talk shows like Letterman and Jay Leno, and somebody who was also of very low self-esteem, despite being such a big star, who suffered enormously because of the judgment that people had of her, and probably forced her into taking more drugs and becoming more reclusive. And I feel that that's a story in itself worth telling. You can't just write someone off because they're on drugs. You have to, it's too easy. I think we're all tempted to write people off. We're always looking for an easy way of judging somebody. And I think she was an extreme example of that. She had a very long height to fall from.
With Whitney Houston, with Amy Winehouse, going back to Janis Joplin, there always seems to be this situation where on the outside they seem confident, they're famous, they're a big celebrity, they have this wonderful veneer of confidence, yet there's always some fragility on the inside that seems very easy for people to exploit. It's a bizarre syndrome of pop culture.
Well, I mean, I think it's tempting to make comparisons between, Amy Winehouse and Whitney Houston and Janis Joplin, but they're actually obviously so different. They couldn't have come from more different backgrounds. and they probably all had rather different pressures placed on them. I suppose all three of them gave everything they could to their art and their performance, which probably left them incredibly vulnerable. And there were people who felt things very strongly. They all had very big hearts, and that's what came out. I guess that's what made them such brilliant, captivating, moving performers, because you could feel their emotion. And I guess you can't expect them to be emotional on stage and then have a way of switching that off and not it also go through into their private lives and the way in which they somehow come down after they've done one of those incredible performances. I think Whitney's background was so complicated. She came from this incredibly deprived area of Newark, which is where she was born, which had the worst race riots next to the ones in Los Angeles. There was a lot of drugs when she was growing up, and she had this gigantic entourage of people who were dependent on her to sort of take them out of Newark. She was supporting not only her own family, but her brother's families, and then Bobby Brown's family, and all his sisters and so on, and they were all dependent on Whitney for their houses, their cars, their schooling for their kids, all that sort of thing. And I think it just was a strain that she couldn't deal with, and that's where her enormous fortune went.
You also have the advantage of having access to this remarkable unfinished documentary footage, which catches her in some of her most revealing moments, including where she appears to be aware of the downward trajectory that she's on. How did you get hold of this footage, and how valuable was that in making the film?
I only got hold of the footage kind of a year into the film, when it was around this time last year, by which time I'd been on the film a year, and I flew over and met Rudy Dorisol, the co-director on the film, and he decided to go into a partnership with me with this footage. And I think Rudy had lots of offers before, but he didn't want to just be a sort of archivist. He had very strong commitment to Whitney Houston and seeing the story done properly. And he had done this amazing job with the footage, but I didn't know until I'd shot most of the film that I was going to have this. And that obviously made an incredible difference to the finished film, because it is so intimate and so beautifully shot by Rudy. So that was a real find. But I didn't obviously know that when I started.
I've got to ask you about the style of this film. People familiar with your work always expect to see you and your boom mic. Not in this movie.
Yeah.
What happened?
No, I think you want to do something different on each film. You don't want to be making the same film all the time. There's been plenty of me with the boom mic, and on the film before this, Tales of the Grim Sleeper, I was much less present in the film. I did some voiceover, but I was very little visually in the film. And on this film, because of Rudy's amazing footage, and because Whitney is such a fascinating subject, I wanted to really tell the story through Whitney's eyes and through her voice, and for it to be very much Whitney's. I wanted the audience to really be sharing the emotions of Whitney Houston, not kind of seeing it through me. I felt I was irrelevant. So it was a great delight, actually, to cut myself out of it.
I got to ask you, just because of the influence that you have had on other filmmakers, and people like Michael Moore and Morgan Spurlock cite you quite quickly when you ask who influenced them. Your name comes up. You made a decision at a particular point to start including things that you don't normally see in documentaries, about the process, about interviews that don't work, about bloopers, and also about the filmmaker changing his mind during the making of a film, which appeared to occur in Gert and Courtney, probably your most famous movie. Can you just tell us why you decided to include that part of the process in the making of documentaries? Because it had a huge effect.
It's very much like keeping a diary while you're making a film. And I think as long as the audience are up to speed with what you're thinking of and why you're doing things, they're on board. And with a film like Gert and Courtney, where my funding got cut off because of pressure that Courtney Love was bringing onto MTV, and things, the original film that I wanted to make was impossible to make because all the music was suddenly unavailable and so on. I felt the only film I could do was the film that was actually taking place, which was that there was enormous pressure to close the film down, that this person who had had a probably a pretty negative influence on Kurt Cobain's life was now trying to control the way in which his story was told. And so in a sense, that became the story. It became a story about control. It became a story about free speech. It became a story about the demise of Kurt Cobain and the theories of Courtney Love's own father, that she was somehow involved in his murder and his death. And so that became the film, really. And because it included the audience in every step of the way, it kind of worked. And it would have been impossible to have made the sort of normal kind of music film because everything had been done to prevent that. So it then became a portrait of all those attempts to close it down, which in a way was very revealing of that world and the persona of Courtney Love, who had hired detectives to intimidate his friends and all the rest of it. It was just a different film, but a very revealing film of that world. But in this particular instance, the instance of Whitney Houston, it wasn't necessary to do that because we had so much material. We had 13 or 14 of her songs. We had this wonderful, intimately shot footage, this breathtaking performance footage of Whitney shot by Rudy. Very, very intimate and telling interviews with the closest people to her who loved her passionately. So there was just no need for my boom pole in this particular story.
Has anybody ever successfully sued you?
Gosh, I wish I had some wood to touch. Not so far. No, they have not.
Right.
Because I've always been careful. I've always told what I believe to be the truth. I've never fabricated anything. People know where they are and why they're in the film and what they're doing. And I think that's part of being a documentary filmmaker. You have to sort of do that. You need to obviously walk on the edge because you're telling a story, hopefully, that's on the edge. You're not telling the sort of obvious story, the safe story. At the same time, it's got to be truthful and it's got to be something that is legally okay.
There's been a lot of talk about the death of journalism, or certainly the death of a certain type of journalism. What do you think the future is for documentaries and documentary makers like you? Do you agree that there's a problem with journalism today? And if so, what's the future?
I think the problem is obviously the enormous difference that the internet has made to the recognized outputs of journalism. But that obviously does not include documentaries that I think have benefited enormously from the enormous social media. And I don't think documentaries have ever been more popular than they are now. All the networks are putting it on. They have an enormous following. They're very well suited to television. So I think all of that has boosted documentaries enormously. And of course, in terms of journalism, you have a very long time to delve into a story. I mean, I had 2 years to really get into the life of Whitney Houston and who she was and the influences in that life. I could look at endless numbers of other pieces that have been done on her. And you have the luxury to, we worked for 7 months on the cut, for example. You just get deeper and deeper and deeper into who that person was. So for me, the making of the Whitney Houston film was really a voyage of discovery in which I think, me and the editor both very much fell in love, I think, with this amazing person that Whitney Houston was, who was this very, very funny person who just couldn't deal with all the pressures that were being brought down on top of her, which is, I think, hopefully is the main thrust of the story. So I think that kind of journalism is very healthy, but I think the traditional journalism that we love and respect, which is centered more on newsprint, is going through a big transition. But I don't think that means that the call for journalism is going. I think it will come back in a stronger form, but we don't know quite where and how yet.
About 10 years ago, mate, you made a really good feature film called The Battle for Haditha. A very powerful movie about a massacre in the Middle East during the First Iraq War. What happened to your feature filmmaking endeavors? Are you still interested?
Well, I am, and I love doing that film that way. and I'd love to do another one. It's just really finding the right subject. I was working on another film, The Catastrophist, which I was going to do with Channel 4 as well, but the commissioner who commissioned Battle for Editha and Ghosts, which was the film I did before, in a similar style, left the company, and the woman who took over Film 4 wanted to make a much more traditional kind of film. So it just kind of languished around, and it's so much easier for me to make documentaries, which is what I'm known for, that I just kind of carried on making documentaries. It was a great experience doing it. I learned so much on it. It had a lot of emotion, and it was something that I so enjoyed doing action as well, which I didn't know. I mean, the wonderful thing about making all films is you discover things that you learn things about things you never thought you would even necessarily enjoy doing. And in Haditha, I learned a lot about shooting action, and which I know I'll return to at some point. I don't know quite when though.
How long have you been living in California now?
Well, really for the last 4 years, because I've got a 4-year-old, and I'm the mom and I split up, and she's living here, so I'm here. Pretty much. Mm-hmm. I mean, I obviously managed to still shoot the Whitney film.
But you've been based in America for a long time, haven't you?
Well, backwards and forwards, and I've generally spent more time in England than I have been in the last 2-3 years. So yes, I have been. I've been in the United States a lot. I'm actually going to England tomorrow. Whoopee! Which I can't wait for. Most of my mates are still there, so I like going back.
Do you want to say anything about what's happened in London?
I think it's tragic and tragic for all the Muslims living in England. I mean, so many Muslims living in London and England. I mean, I think they're something like 10% of the population. So I think it's tragic for them that this has happened. And I think it's such a cowardly act, such a cowardly and completely irresponsible act. These people are just completely innocent bystanders, and the cowardice is that it's so arbitrary and it's almost impossible to police, and it's a terrible example for everybody. And I think that in some ways the Muslim community has got to try and police themselves, otherwise this is going to come down, unfortunately, in a terrible way against them, and that's the last thing one wants to see happen.